Right, so get ready, because we're taking a deep dive today into some pretty choppy waters. Donald Trump, back in the White House. You guys shared some pretty potent stuff with us, a YouTube video analysis and also a blog post by a Canadian who actually moved back from the U.S. after Trump won. And just reading through this stuff, I have to say, this is big. This is potentially huge. I mean, we're talking possible shockwaves across everything, the economy, global power dynamics, even how things might shake out up in Canada for you guys.
Yeah. And it's really fascinating to me, looking at these two sources, obviously different formats, different perspectives, but there's this common thread running through both of them. It's like they're both saying, listen, a second Trump term could completely rewrite the rules of the game, not just the U.S., but globally.
It's exactly. And for you listening to this isn't just some, political drama happening down south. This could have a direct impact on your day-to-day life. So let's break it down together.
What really jumped out at me from both sources right off the bat was the potential for massive domestic policy shifts. I mean, the YouTube video uses some pretty strong language, transformative challenges. It's hinting at a pretty radical agenda.
Yeah, and the blog post gets even more specific. Like, they highlight deregulation as a key focus of a potential second Trump term.
Right.
And their argument is basically this could be a huge boon for businesses, but maybe not so much for environmental and social concerns. One point they make that I found really striking is that we could be looking at a return to kind of a 1980s regulatory landscape. I mean, think about that, a rollback of literally decades of protections.
Wow, back to the 80s, huh? That's a pretty big statement.
Right. And it's not just rolling back regulations either. They talk about this idea of Trump stacking government agencies with loyalists, basically sidelining experts, silencing any dissenting voices. They highlight the EPA, the FDA as prime examples. Okay, so we're talking about a potential scenario here. Think back to Trump's first term, but amplified. More deregulation, more loyalists in key positions. And the blog post takes it even further. They suggest this could impact everything. I mean, from scientific research funding to public health guidance.
Exactly. I mean, imagine a situation where scientific findings that contradict the administration's agenda are just, suppressed or discredited, or where public health recommendations are shaped more by political calculations than, actual scientific evidence. I mean, those are some pretty worrying implications.
No doubt about it. And then there's the whole economic question. Both sources touch on this, but in kind of different ways. The YouTube video keeps it pretty broad.
Yeah.
Just mentions like economic growth and inequality.
But the blog post really digs into some specifics, and it's an interesting argument. They're saying we might see an initial surge in economic activity driven by, tax cuts and deregulation, but the gains are likely to be concentrated at the top, which means the gap between the wealthy and everyone else could actually widen.
So it's a short-term sugar rush for the economy, but potentially long-term pain for everyday Americans?
That's the concern. They use this term a K-shaped recovery, where the wealthy and corporations see rapid growth. But working-class families are struggling with stagnant wages and rising costs for, housing, healthcare, all the essentials.
So basically what they're saying is the rising tide won't lift all boats, just the yachts.
Exactly, and they don't stop there. The blog post also raises concerns about potential cuts to social safety net programs, things like Medicare, Social Security, all under this banner of, fiscal responsibility.
So not only could the average American be facing a tougher time making ends meet, but the support systems that are supposed to be there to help them through tough times could be weakened.
Precisely. And you can see how that would create a recipe for heightened social tensions, even unrest, and something both sources actually warn about. But the blog post goes deeper into how Trump's rhetoric specifically could really exacerbate existing divisions, especially along lines of, race, religion, immigration status.
That's a pretty bleak picture. And you know what? This is where things get especially interesting for you listening to this up in Canada, because the blog post really goes deep on how all of this could spill over the border and impact Canada specifically.
Yeah, the author, being a Canadian returnee, has this really unique perspective on how a second Trump term could really strain relations between the two countries, potentially impacting trade, immigration, even Canada's sense of security.
All right, so let's just pause here for a second and let all that sink in. Potential rollback of regulations, widening wealth gap, heightened social tensions. Definitely some food for thought.
It's a lot to process, and trust me, we've only just scratched the surface. When we come back, we'll delve into how these domestic shifts could ripple outwards, first impacting Canada and then the entire global landscape. Welcome back. I hope you had a chance to kind of let all that settle in, because now we're going to shift gears a little bit and look at how all these potential changes in the U.S. could impact Canada specifically. Remember that Canadian returnee who wrote the blog post? Go really deep on this.
Yeah, I was reading through that, and it's almost like they're sounding an alarm bell. I mean, they paint a pretty stark picture of how Trump's policies could create these ripple effects, reaching way beyond U.S. borders, directly impacting Canada's economy, its social fabric, even its political landscape.
It's a sobering assessment for sure. One of the most immediate impacts they argue could be felt in the realm of trade. Remember, Trump's America First approach? That led to some pretty intense trade disputes during his first term, and the blog post suggests those tensions could easily flare up again.
Yeah, and they don't just speak in general terms either. They highlight specific industries like Canadian lumber, steel, auto manufacturing as potential targets, for tariffs or other protectionist measures.
Exactly. And their argument is that while these measures might be intended to protect American jobs, they could end up hurting businesses and consumers on both sides of the border. And it's not just about the economic impact either. These trade disputes can quickly escalate into political conflicts, further straining that already kind of delicate relationship between the two countries.
Right, and the author even points to the personal animosity between Trump and Prime Minister Trudeau, adding fuel to that fire. They mention those tense G7 summits, those, barbed comments exchanged on Twitter, suggesting that a second Trump term could bring even more friction.
And they go as far as to suggest that Trump might actually try to exert political influence within Canada, potentially supporting political movements that align with his own ideology.
Wow, trying to sway Canadian politics.
Yeah.
It's a pretty bold claim.
Yeah.
But, given Trump's track record of meddling in other countries' affairs, it's not entirely out of the realm of possibility.
It's definitely something to watch out for. And then there's the whole issue of immigration. The author makes a really interesting point about how Canada's traditional role as a safe haven for people seeking refuge might be challenged under a second Trump presidency.
They argue that Canada, while generally welcoming to immigrants, is already dealing with its own set of challenges, strained resources, a growing backlog of asylum applications. And their point is that a surge in U.S. citizens trying to, relocate to Canada could put even more strain on the system.
It's a complex issue for sure. No easy solutions. And the author doesn't shy away from the fact that this situation could spark some serious social and political debates within Canada about, the limits of its generosity and the need to balance compassion with practicality.
So for you listening to this up in Canada, these potential impacts are pretty significant. It's not just about some abstract political drama happening down south. It's about how those events could directly affect your life, your community, the future of your country.
Absolutely. And remember, all of this is happening against a backdrop of potential global instability. Both sources, the YouTube video and the blog post, warn about how a second Trump term could really upend the global order, creating a more unpredictable and potentially dangerous world.
All right, let's pause here for a second and reflect. We've covered potential trade wars, political friction, a potential surge in immigration from the U.S. Pretty intense stuff for Canada.
It is, and when we come back, we'll zoom out even further. Explore how these shifts could reshape the geopolitical landscape, from Eastern Europe and Asia to the Middle East and beyond.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from potential upheaval in U.S. domestic policy to those ripple effects reaching all the way up to Canada. But now let's zoom out even further. Consider the global implications of Trump back in the White House. Both of the sources, we looked at the YouTube video and that blog post, paint a pretty unsettling picture. You know how this could reshape the entire geopolitical landscape?
Yeah, the YouTube video uses some pretty dramatic language, talking about uncharted territory and tectonic shifts. But it's the blog post that really dives into the specifics, breaking it down region by region. And it's pretty clear they see a second Trump term as a really destabilizing force on the world stage.
Yeah, and reading through it, I kept thinking back to Trump's first term. Who kind of shook things up with that America First approach, pulling out of international agreements, imposing tariffs, just generally challenging the established global order. But what really stood out to me in the blog post was their analysis of Eastern Europe, particularly the situation in Ukraine.
Right, yeah, it's a crucial point. Their argument is basically that Trump's skepticism towards continued U.S. support for Ukraine, combined with, his seemingly pretty cozy relationship with Putin, that this could embolden Russia and potentially lead to further aggression. They even raised the possibility of a forced peace settlement, one that favors Russia and leaves Ukraine extremely vulnerable.
And they suggest that this wouldn't just be a regional conflict either. It could have ripple effects across all of Europe, undermining NATO, emboldening other authoritarian regimes. Essentially, they see it as this potential domino effect that could reshape the entire European security landscape.
It's a pretty chilling thought, and the blog post doesn't stop there. They also highlight Asia, specifically the situation with China and Taiwan as another potential flashpoint. They point to Trump's unpredictable approach to China during his first term, swinging between confrontation and, attempts at deal-making.
Yeah, and they suggest that this unpredictability could be even more pronounced in a second term, which, raises the risk of miscalculations and escalation. They paint this picture of a region on edge, where even a small spark could ignite a major conflict.
Exactly. And they actually draw a direct link between the situation in Ukraine and the situation in Asia. They're arguing that if the U.S. appears weak or indecisive in one region, it could embolden China to act more assertively in the other. It's like this global game of chicken with incredibly high stakes.
And what about the Middle East? It sounds like more of the same. Continued strong support for Israel and Saudi Arabia, coupled with even greater pressure on Iran.
Yeah, the blog post predicts a continuation of those policies, which could lead to further instability in a region that's already incredibly volatile. They suggest that Trump might double down on sanctions against Iran, potentially pushing the country closer to the brink, and raising the risk of conflict even further.
So it sounds like we're looking at a global picture with potential hotspots in Eastern Europe, in Asia, in the Middle East, all exacerbated by what the blog post describes as a potential American retreat from global leadership.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in, but it's crucial to understand these interconnected dynamics. The choices made in Washington have consequences that reverberate around the world. And for you listening to this, someone who's clearly engaged with global events, these are issues that could directly impact your life, your work, even your sense of the world's future.
Absolutely. And, one thing that really struck me from both sources was this sense of uncertainty, this not knowing what to expect. They both acknowledge that predicting the future is impossible, especially with someone as, unpredictable as Trump at the helm.
Yeah, that's the biggest takeaway for me. We're entering uncharted territory here. And the only certainty is uncertainty. It's not about predicting specific events. It's about understanding those underlying trends, the potential risks, and the choices that we face as individuals and as a global community.
That's a great point to end on, I think. We've explored some pretty heavy stuff in this deep dive, from domestic policy shifts to global power struggles. But ultimately, it's up to each of us to process this information, engage in some critical thinking, and decide how we want to navigate this uncertain future. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.